Welcome to A Shelter in the Time of Storm. My name is Roger Comstock. I'm the minister for the Morrison Church of Christ in Morrison, Tennessee. As you know, if you've watched our program before, you understand that the purpose of our program is to try to help people as they deal with the storms of life, how we can maintain our faith through the tragic things that happen in our lives and keep that kind of relationship with God that we should have. We have a special privilege today. We have a special guest with us. Beth Baker is with us today, and she is the author of a book about her family's journey. The name of the book is Giving Him Back to God, Caleb's Journey. The book is about their journey with their son Caleb. Caleb passed away about 13 months ago, I think, and so we're going to be talking today about that journey with Beth, and referring to the book some and talking about this difficult journey that they have been through and what they've learned from it, how they've grown from it, and how they've maintained their faith through these difficult things. Beth, welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me.
I'm glad that you could be with us today. Beth, if you would, tell us a little bit about Caleb's birth and how his life began, the first couple of years of his life.
He was a huge baby. He was 9 pounds and 4 ounces, and
wow.
He was a big boy. And he was jaundiced when he was born. That was the only problem that he had. He was my third child, so he was a scheduled C-section baby. After the first two, we knew we needed to have another one. So, but he was very very healthy. He was a very content baby. He didn't cry a whole lot. He didn't fuss very much, except for bath time. But he quickly learned to like water. Within the first year of his life, he met normal milestones, maybe a little slow. He would sit up and crawl and learn to walk pretty much on target, maybe a little bit slower than the average. But he was a little boy, and he was our third, so we had big sisters to help do everything for him, so we didn't worry with that very much. But by the time he was about, he had his second birthday, we knew that something was different with him. He did not respond to us when we would, give him a direction. Some of his talking had ceased. He had several words that he no longer would say. Most children around 15 months to 2 years, they'll at least gesture. If they see something that they want, they'll point. And he quit doing those things where he would try to engage us in his experience. And so we spoke to the pediatrician about seeing that change, and he advised us to go for some testing. So.
And where did you go for the testing?
We had. There was a contact in Louisville. It's called the Weisskopf Child Development Center, and they do behavioral testing for autism. And we, based on his symptoms and just some research that I'd done, I felt like we were going down that path. And so we had already, previous to the diagnosis, made some changes in how we spoke to him, how we interacted with him. And we're seeing some positive improvement. And so just having a grasp on the diagnosis finally, there's usually a very long waiting period for diagnosis. And our waiting time was over 9 months. Wow. And so I felt like we didn't need to lose time, and that if we could help him anyway with what little we could learn to do, that we needed to intervene as soon as possible. And so we enrolled him into a preschool based on that. We all knew ultimately what the diagnosis would be, but enrolled him in preschool and speech therapy, and we did a lot of things at home differently with him, as far as how we spoke to him, how we interacted with him. We always told him positive things to do, not what not to do. And so everyone in the family kind of embraced that and knew that, in order for him to succeed, we were all going to have to change the way that we did things, and that included the way we parented.
Okay. And so he was what, about 3 years old when he was actually diagnosed
Yes.
with autism.
Yes.
And even though, and I know from talking to you, I know you have spent a lot of time on the internet and researching, and you had even referred to yourself as having a Google MD.
Yes.
And I think that's a valuable lesson for people too, that folks who maybe have some concerns about their child and the development of the child, that they educate themselves.
Sure. And, you know, the internet was just kind of up and coming during the early years for us. And so I had to be real careful, though, about what I chose to read on the internet. You know, there's a plethora of information out there, but you really have to consider the sources that you're coming from. And so I was very careful about who I read and what I read. But most of the places that I did read articles from or abstracts from were universities that are known for their medical skills and knowledge and research.
And particularly expertise in the field of autism.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I was very careful to make sure that, you know, there are a lot of things out there that are going to say that they're going to help your child, or, you know, you need to buy this now, and that kind of mentality. And it's really easy to think, oh, there's just something out there that's going to fix all this, you know, and because it's hard enough to deal with it, with receiving a diagnosis like that.
Right.
But just to be careful about being real about what we were dealing with. I felt like, you know, it was to my benefit and for his benefit that I was really careful about what we tried and how we proceeded with his therapies.
You said at about 2 years old is when you began to really notice some things weren't what we would consider normal with
Sure.
Caleb. As you educated yourself and you had almost diagnosed the problem before you were able to actually get tested and so forth, if you can, talk a little bit about what you went through as a mother, the emotions, what you felt when there's something wrong with my child.
Well, first you go into denial. I mean,
Okay.
you immediately start grieving your child. And the first thing I did was deny it. Was watching a program on the Today Show that just had information about autism because of the prevalence and, you know, the increase in numbers. And I was picking apart the program, going, oh, he can do that, or oh no, he might not do that, but he does it sometimes. You know, I was rationalizing why it shouldn't be that he had autism, and so I was really clearly in the whole denial stage of this is, you know, I don't want us to be going there for him because it's a loss for him. You know, you think of your child when they're born, they're perfect, and you think of all the opportunities, and of course every parent has dreams and goals for their children, but when you realize that you're faced with something that you didn't see coming, and especially with a diagnosis that can be extremely debilitating for some children, you know, you wonder where your child is going to be on that spectrum.
Sure.
You know, are they going to be high functioning? Are they going to be low functioning? Are they going to have mental retardation? Are they going to be able to go to school? I mean, all of those simple goals that most families take for granted, being able to send your child to public school. You know, what kind of a battle, I mean, all of those questions about what kind of a battle is every day going to be, they come rushing in. And so I denied them at first. And then once I quickly realized that denying it wasn't going to make it go away. And so the next thing I did was accept it. And, you know, of course, there were days when I was angry about the whole situation. I mean, you know, why did it have to be my child that had to deal with these things, you know, to not be able to speak anymore, to not understand what we're saying to him, you know, that wasn't fair. But in reality, that's what it was. And so I guess my personality kicked in. I'm not one to swim in the depths of despair for very long, and so I said, you know what? If we're gonna do that, you know, if we're gonna help him, then it's gonna take me learning everything I can about it, and then pulling together a team and getting everybody on board.
I failed to mention when I introduced you, you and your family are members of the Maple Hill
Yes.
Church of Christ
Yes.
in Paducah, Kentucky.
Yes.
And tell me, from a spiritual aspect, you mentioned the denial and the anger. Who were you angry at?
Just at the situation itself.
Okay.
You know, I think people sometimes when they're faced with circumstances like that, they immediately want to blame God
Right.
for whatever is happening. And God didn't create evil. God didn't create bad.
You're exactly right.
You know, He created good. And so I think the biggest part of that was learning that, you know, I may not like autism, but there is some good that's going to come out of this. And seeing how we changed how we parented, it was a really good change. Seeing how others interacted with our child, that was a really good change. We allowed people to come into his life that were positive. And so, and having our church family to be supportive of us was a huge thing. You know, just to know that, you know, there were times when he was unable to deal with being in Bible school class.
Right.
You know, I had two dear friends who were his teachers who made flashcards of every Bible thing you could ever think of. And when they taught a lesson, they had every visual card for everything so that he could, if there was any way that he was making those connections that day, that he could benefit from the Bible lesson just like his peers in that setting. Sure. And so for people to go out of their way to adapt, you know, how they do things on an everyday basis to accommodate your child, that just shows what goodness is out there. And so to me, that you know, thinking of how we're going to make this okay, how we're going to make this a blessing, how we're going to make this something good, that was the turning point.
When did, and kind of moving along in Caleb's life and his journey, your family's journey, when did you were diagnosed at about age 3? In your book, you detail a lot about the seizures that began. When did you first notice seizures? And from just my own curiosity, is there a connection between autism and the seizures?
There is a 20 to 30% chance on average for a child with autism to develop epilepsy. So there's clearly an increased chance for epilepsy. And in research, I'd read that statistic several times, but you don't ever want to go to the next step.
So if I can interrupt you, when was he first diagnosed with epilepsy?
He was diagnosed July of 2006.
So how old would he?
He was going to turn 5 that year.
Okay. And had you seen seizures prior to that?
Yes, but
well, obviously.
yes, but did not know what they were. He had a type of seizure that's called an absence seizure, and those are just staring spells. And the problem with having an autism diagnosis and having absence seizures is a lot of times those are dismissed as, well, they have autism, they're mentally impaired, so they're just staring off. Well, not every child is just staring off. And so, you know, trying to interrupt that stare and seeing if they will react to you, that was a big eye-opening for us that maybe something else was going on. And a preschool teacher actually came to me and said, you know, I think he may be having some seizure activity. And we had the intention of pursuing that and had not got to that appointment yet before his first full complex partial seizure happened.
So what went through your mind when you heard the word epilepsy in reference to your child?
I already knew. I mean, the very first seizure I saw him have, I knew he had epilepsy. While that was hard to digest, I really guess we kind of just accepted it as part of who Caleb was and what he was going to have to deal with. And so, you know, it was just, while it was devastating, of course,
Sure.
you know, we were still hopeful that, you know, maybe he could be one of those kids who recovers. I mean, epilepsy has really good statistics on, medically being able to intervene with medication that will, at least subside seizure activity, or, there are some who have had epilepsy who are completely recovered or would be considered in remission. And so, we were hopeful that maybe he was, among that group that, eventually would outgrow or would be recovered from the epilepsy.
And in your book, I learned a lot from your book. Some of the medical terms I won't even attempt to pronounce, but I was very interesting to me to learn that of a variety of kinds of seizures.
Sure.
That you, by your study and your research on your own, had been able to identify.
Sure.
And I guess, I know you're not a doctor other than a Google doctor, but I was rather curious, you named 4 or 5 different kinds of seizures, I think, that Caleb had. Mm-hmm. Where do these different kinds of seizures, where do they come from? I mean, how does the brain work? And I assume that's the cause of these different kinds of seizures. Sure. But how do they manifest themselves, and where do they come from?
In his case, they came from all over.
All over his brain.
All over his brain. Mm-hmm. When we received his diagnosis, first of epilepsy, we had his care in Louisville for a couple of years, and we moved his care to Nashville, and they did some extensive testing on him. And when they came back to us, they explained that each time we were teaching him a new skill, he would regress terribly, have terrible regression of skill in other areas. And so what we were doing was actually trying to teach him a new skill. And they talk about, you get a new wrinkle on your brain when you learn something. We were creating pathways of learning. Mm-hmm. And so those neurons, they're developing, they're changing in a small child, and you're trying to make connections. For every connection we made, we created a new path for a seizure to take. So, interesting. Yes, and that was very eye-opening to us, because that explained to us what we had been seeing for such a long time, would be, him to have great progress and then terrible regression. And usually the seizure activity would, coincide with that regression. And so, and that was, while disheartening and terrible to hear something like that, again, it was, at least we had an explanation of what we'd been seeing all along. And so he actually had a condition called diffuse bilateral cortical dysplasia, which basically means the frontal lobes of his brain were not fully developed in utero, and they never attached, those neurons never attached to the center of his brain, the cerebral cortex. Mm-hmm. So all this white matter with dangling, material there, was basically the cause of his epilepsy, and likely the cause of his autistic-looking symptoms early on in development.
Is that a typical problem connected to autism, the dysplasia?
No, his dysplasia is extremely rare.
And so, if I'm understanding you right, these different kinds of seizures actually originate in different portions of the brain.
Sure.
And you're saying that part of his brain did not develop.
Right.
So it wasn't just a matter of wasn't a connection, it just didn't develop.
It did not develop in utero appropriately. And so, of course, he had healthy parts of his brain that, for speech, his temporal lobes were intact and were, those areas, while still functioning, you still have connectors in there that aren't wired just right. And so he had seizures that encompassed all areas of his brain. And, there are some seizures that can start in one area, which are focal seizures, but then they can also generalize across the brain. And when that happens, then you see a generalized seizure, which is what most people are accustomed to when they think of seizure, what they typically would assume that they would see, just a general, convulsion, a tonic-clonic convulsion.
So is that the term you use in the book? You talk about clustering seizures.
Yes, he had seizures that were repetitive. They would never break. He would have, and you can have different kinds of clusterings of seizures. He had myoclonic seizures, which are just brief jerks, and I saw him have thousands in a day at some times. You can have clustering of tonic seizures. You can have clustering of partial seizures. You can have clustering of any kind, and usually that's when you're at that point, you're going to have to intervene with some kind of either emergency care or medication.
Right. You mentioned medication. And again, in reading your book, I was just amazed at the, I think, how many different anticonvulsant type medications was he on?
We exhausted over 14 in 4 years.
So, and some of them at the same time, but
Sure.
generally try one. And it was interesting, you mentioned in the book also that Caleb's brain, and you refer to it as being magnificent.
Sure.
And I appreciate your attitude.
Sure.
But you talked about the human brain, God made it in a way that it's going to work its way around any obstacle that we humans may be put in the way.
Sure, sure.
And those drugs, medications are obstacles to try to prevent the seizures. So
Absolutely.
his brain was determined to have the seizures, so it would find a way around the obstacles we call medication.
Right, right.
And I've read of your home routine, and I don't know how it just amazes me. But you talked about the almost endless back-to-back seizures, and I'm assuming that also there were different kinds of seizures at the same time.
Right. Well, they would. He typically would start with one pattern of seizures, and then it would develop into another.
I see.
Most of those seizures would start at bedtime when he was trying to go to sleep. So he would start with myoclonic seizures, just brief jerks. Those are generalized seizures, but then they would precipitate tonic activity, and so then he would typically cluster maybe 50 to 100 myoclonic seizures, and then he would go into tonic seizures, and they would be repetitive. They would happen every 5 to 10 minutes, just like clockwork. And eventually, if we were lucky, they would dissipate over about an hour of him going to sleep. Then he would eventually, be able to seize and have that last one before he got a break, And sometimes, our night would be, I would be woken up in the middle of the night with him seizing, and so they would be back again, and then he would cluster again. And so that was his pattern. And most children don't have as many seizures in a day as what he encountered. I've met several families, though, who are walking in similar paths. Right. And so they are out there, and we weren't alone in it by any means. But as a whole, when you talk about epilepsy, not everyone has the same, right. Number and,
right.
and continual seizing that he had to deal with and go through.
And if I understand correctly, of all these different medications, that some would sort of slow it down a little,
sure.
but nothing ever really worked to just stop them.
No, and that's when you talk about his magnificently made brain. If normal for you is seizing, you're always going to try to find a way to go back to that. I mean, that was how his brain was made. That was what was normal for him, was to have seizures. And so for everything we combated those with, he, his brain was so well made that he would find a way, within a few weeks. We would have that, we call it the honeymoon period, where everything's great and we're seeing a reduction in seizures for just a brief while, and we got our hopes up and we were encouraged. And then the third or fourth week would come along and we'd be going right back to where we came from. And of course, we had excellent doctors that talked to me weekly, who would make sure that we were at the top levels of everything. We were combating it with everything that we had all the time.
And new medications.
And new medication if necessary, or pulling him away from medications, or checking his blood levels and making sure, because certain blood levels of medications are optimal at certain levels in your blood, and so we found out what range he, would typically be stable at, and so we would try to maintain those levels for him so that he would at least be somewhat stable, even though he was seizing all the time.
Do you have a number? How many total medications, prescription medications, was Caleb on during his lifetime? Do you have any idea?
As far as anticonvulsants, we exhausted over 14.
But I mean,
total medications, I have no idea. I would guess probably in the 30s range. And of course all of them at different times and different combinations of things. But of course later on in his life, when he started having other issues medically, of course, then other medications came into play to just to give him comfort and for him to be able to sustain food and those kinds of things. And
just if you could, an average day, how many seizures could you anticipate in just an average day? And I know it varied largely, but
average 100 to 150 a day.
100 seizures a day.
Yes.
And if you could real quickly, we probably don't have time to go into it, but I'm curious as to what that seizure, what that does in the brain. I mean, and what the reaction is maybe. Is that?
For him, not that he necessarily would remember the seizure per se. Myoclonic seizures were really aggravating to him.
Would be the
brief jerks constantly, and he could be sitting at rest watching. Barney was his favorite show, and so he could be watching Barney, and he would just get too still, and I knew that they were coming, and he almost anticipated them. He got to where he anticipated them, and he would be very still, and usually he would look for me, or he would pat for that meant you need to come sit here, and of course then the seizures would come into play, and so. But they were very aggravating for him. And sometimes he would, like, leave me alone, that kind of, but especially the tonic seizures, those are so overwhelming just for and traumatic for your body to have to deal with that, usually he was very listless after those.
We are out of time and we haven't nearly covered all that we'd like to, so we're going to do a couple other programs with Beth Baker, and she's a special guest, and we'll have some of her family members in other programs as well. But there will be contact information for how to find her book and purchase her book, and that contact information will be running at the end of the program. I'm glad you could be with us today. Have a great day.